Well, there we are. Once again, the old school, part two. Now, yesterday I gave you the physical description of the school, and that's important to understand, because I'm looking at the difference between then and now, and the, if you like, the philosophies that shape how you present a school. And I was looking at, in a sense, the contrast between the old school from the 1880s through until when it burned down in 1957 and what I see now. Not just in terms of the buildings that I see, but in terms of the learning or the learning that I see or saw, and the learning now that I don't see. So, there's a philosophy that lies behind each of them, and so that's why the description of the physical setup was important. But I wanted to deal also with the people who made the school run, and so you had to have teachers and you had to have students. And in those days, you didn't have much else. These days, you have aides and cleaners and secretarial staff and oh, God only knows what not. But there was none of that in those days. There was just the principal, the teachers, and the kids. That was it. And there must have been cleaners, I suppose, but I can't recall. They must have been there, but I don't recall. I can't even recall seeing cleaners, but I don't know, maybe we just took a certain amount of disorder for granted, but still. Anyway, what I wanted to do today, to start with anyway, was to deal with the teachers that we had there. Now, the teachers fell into, there are two categories, I suppose. The first category were the teachers themselves, and the second category, the grander category, of course, was old Borley, the principal, who was there, as I say, from 1935 through until 1952. So what I thought I would do is just to tell you about the teachers and the stories attached there too. Now, bearing in mind that I record, in a sense, a sort of a kind of history. These are the events of history, if you like. But remember, I'm recording them from the mind of a 10-year-old, whatever age I may have been, anything from a 5-year-old through to about a 13 or maybe a 14-year-old. And so it's the view of a child of that period. And so how was the world seen through someone of that? And from our particular background, Lower King Street. So that you have to interpret everything I tell you in those terms, or through those terms, if you like, or despite those terms. I tell you every now and then, there's a story attached. Well, of course, the stories are the stories that we all knew and we all told over the years. Many people will have forgotten most of them, but I think I've forgotten fairly few of them. But you need to remember that they are stories. And they're stories that were told in the school and in our part of town, and they were stories that we chose to either believe or doubt or whatever it may have been. But, it's not Holy Writ. You need to bear that in mind. But you've also got to bear in mind that what's important in any history, if you like, that's rarely written, are the attitudes of the people of the time. Now, you remember I always say that we came from Lower King Street. No, we had our feelings, we had our attitudes. But they did never make the Charleville Times. I mean, insofar as they made the Charleville Times, they were Charleville Times through the, police reports, court reports, and things like that. Or when there was a fracas, we may well have been mentioned. But, it was the elite whose history and attitudes were recorded in newspapers and wherever else. Not the things that are important to us, or not the world as we saw it. We were either forgotten or... And I think, well, damn you. The elite may have made the newspapers, but there was a life and a history and a set of attitudes going on parallel with that, and may have been very, very different from that. And so one of the purposes of my doing these things is to record our history. This was the history of the lower King Street, the history of the lower part of town. This is how we felt about things. And if we had written a history, this is what we would have written. And I can assure you, some of the worthies of a town would not have come out of it too well, because their stories, if you like, were very often never actually printed. But we knew them, and we would certainly have printed them, I can assure you of that. Okay, well now let's start. What I'm going to do is go through the teachers, just the teachers that I had from the time I started school and so on. And that carried with it a certain fact of their being present and their having taught me. But it also bore with it a certain number of attitudes, if we like. Okay. Now, I remember the very first day that I went to school. I wanted to go to school. I was keen to go to school. I could hardly wait to get to school. I had taught myself to read before I went to school. I knew the alphabet and I knew all the, those early reading books. I don't think I taught myself to write. I can't remember writing anything. But I certainly could read and read fairly well by the time I went to school. And this was all self-taught. But it was easy enough to do. There was the Beck's sign up in front of Moore's shop, B-E-X, Beck's. B says B, X, that was obvious. B, X. Oh, there we are, no trouble. And then, the next stage, I was playing down near we'll call it the toilet. Those little thunder boxes that people used to have in the very back of their yard. And Jack Jeffries, the Gidgee Nightman, would come each week and cart the can away. And I was playing down there one day, and I knew my mother's name was May, and I also knew that May was M-A-Y. And suddenly, I was thinking, well, if May is M-A-Y, Ray must be R-A-Y. So I went down to her mother and I said, she was washing at the time, in one of those old wash tubs that people had, with a clothesline propped up with a mulga branch that always fell on the ground. My father was no fence maker, and clothesline maker and so on. The clothes often ended up in the dirt. But nevertheless, I went down to her and I said, Mum, if May is M-A-Y, would Ray be R-A-Y? Yes, she said. Well, what with May, Ray and Beck's, everything was unlocked. And so I was keen to get off to school. But there was no great ceremony about getting off to school in those days. I remember the first day, but I can't remember, teams or hordes of crying kids. I can't remember doting mothers. It was the first day, and so I was to be taken to school. I was keen to go, but there was no great ceremony connected with it. It was the first day of school. My mother certainly had no intention of going with me, nor would anyone have thought that it was necessary for her to go with me. But two girls who lived nearby, one of them my Aunt Elsie, who was no Rhodes Scholar, and another girl, I don't know who it would have been. They were going to school, of course. They were rather older than I was, and so they took me. But they sort of delivered me as a kind of package. They took me, and there was a place where the babies, those who were going into first babies, stood and waited, and they deposited me there, and so I waited in line until the grand opening. I don't know, I suppose the grand opening began at about 9, and Totty Connolly would have appeared. And no, I can't remember any parents crying kids or anything. It was a fairly ordinary sort of day, I suppose. But it wasn't really an ordinary day for me. I was really very keen to go. I don't know, I was very enthusiastic about it. And I knew that Totty would be teaching me because everybody knew. For generations, everybody knew that when you started school, Totty would be teaching you. Totty, I think, was born in 1888, and she had become a pupil teacher. That would have meant that when she was about 12 or 13, she became a pupil teacher, like a junior apprentice. And I know that she began work out at Langloh, and because my grandfather did a lot of work out Langloh Way, and I remember he was telling me that early in the century, Totty was a pupil teacher at Langlois State School. That would have made Totty, 12 or 13. I don't know whether entry was determined by age or whether entry was determined by whether she had done scholarship or not. I don't really know that one. But anyway, Totty had long since been at the Charleville State School, and she had taught all of my father's generation, and she taught a fair number of my brothers and sisters, not all of them, but about half of them, I think. And so I knew that Totty was going to be there. Now, Totty was much loved by everybody, and those of us who were taught by her will surely always remember her. She knew her trade very, very well, and she understood children of that age very, very well. And so, as I say, I could read, I knew the alphabet, I knew all of those things before I went on. That probably made me a bit of a pain in the bum, I suppose, because I had the impression Totty probably was not accustomed to that sort of thing. But anyway, Totty began teaching us, and she simultaneously did two things. One, she had to teach us the alphabet so we could read, and then she had to teach us the skills involved in the writing style of the period. Now, the writing style of the period was not the printing that people do these days. You began from the beginning learning the inclined cursive script. Now, the inclined cursive script was all very well. I don't really know that it was a good script for teaching children in schools, but it was a good script if you were going to be a penman, penmanship, and you had plenty of time, and you had ink and lovely nibs and that sort of thing, and so you could write that lovely copperplate handwriting. And so it was formed by curves and loops and strokes and so on. And the way you began teaching that, of course, was through the exercises of pothooks. Now, pothooks went, let me see, I'm sure there must be a piece of paper here somewhere. Yes, here we are. And of course, our slates were ruled and so on, but I don't know that mattered very much. Well, I'll give you a pothook. There's one pothook. There's another pothook. And there is the ultimate pothook. You see, 1, 2, 3. Pothook this way, pothook that way, and a pothook that way. And it was very easy because if you then formed a letter of some kind, we'll say D. I'm just choosing D. D up here, down here. Oh dear, I'm slipping a bit. Okay, well there's D, you see. And so your pothook is here. This part here, there. And let me find another one. T. Oh dear, that's very horrible, T. But nevertheless, you can see there's your pothook. And because of the hooks on the end, you could then do the inclined cursive and all of your letters joined together. Because you could do A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, as you can see, you learned from the beginning how to join your letters together, A, B, C, D. Everything could, in one, dip of the pen, and you could write the whole word, each letter joining the other. And so Totty taught us that, and so we began a few months of training of pothooks on our slates. And as I told you, we didn't have paper or anything like that, but we had a slate. And this slate, this is a sort of super-duper slate. This is this is a 5-star plate. It's got a frame around it. I can't remember too many frames in Totty's classroom. We had the slate and, give out the slates, and they'd give out these slabs of slate, and the pencils had a tin holder and so on, and that's what we actually wrote with. And then Totty had a lot of charts, and wait a minute, I've got them here. Where did I find it? Well, I had rather more trouble than I thought. I said, I've got them here, I'll find them. I was thinking of my Chinese bookcase. When I got up to find them, I thought, oh dear, That's in China, so I had to give in and I had to go elsewhere. But here is I found I had another set. That was the very first reading book that we had, the Prep 1 reader. And if I open it up, then you can see it. And so Toddy began teaching this. A like an apple on a twig, A says A, B like a bat and ball, B says C like a cake with a bite taken out, D drags a drum, and so on. How does that go? It goes down. A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. E like an egg, E says A, and so on. And that's what Toddy began teaching us. Well, I knew all of those things, and I knew the letters, and I knew the sounds, and so on. But I couldn't write them, and it was the pothooks that led me into being able to write them. But I did learn one thing, though, from Toddy's charts and the alphabet, and that's to never trust the mob. Never trust the mob. And the wisdom also of the Japanese idea that, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. Well, I remember being hammered down very early in the piece, by the mob, I might add. Totty taught in one room, but her charts and so on were in the room next door. And we used to go in there, and Toddy would have these great big charts, on a chart stand, and you'd turn over the page. I suppose they've all been burnt now. Pity that they've been burnt, but nevertheless. Toddy taught us up to J, I suppose. I think she taught us to J, and we were not supposed to know anything beyond J. And so we would begin, and Toddy was there, like conducting an orchestra. A like an apple on a twig, A says A, B like a bat and ball, B says B, C like a cake with a bite taken out, and so on. Okay. Well, round about C or D or something like this one day, bearing in mind that we had been taught to J, Toddy found it necessary to leave the room for a short while and to go into the next room. And we were told to keep on going. Okay, well, we were all squatted on the floor, no ceremony, a wooden floor, and, nothing like that. We just squatted on the floor, but no one thought anything, no one thought that was unusual in any way at all. Anyway, we were there, the mob of us, I don't know how many, A like an apple on a twig, or A like an apple on a twig, A says A, and so on. And we began, and Toddy left. Well, you get into the swing of things, you see, and so A like an apple on a twig, A says A, B like a bat and ball. We knew up to J, J like a jumping fish, J says J. No. At that point we were supposed to come to a stop, because we had only been taught that far. I anyway was in full flight, up to J. Now K, of course, K comes after J. H-I-J-K. Well, they stopped. That's the mob. Stopped at J. Well, I wasn't stopping. K kicks the ball. K says K. And so on. I kept on going. Well, shock. Maybe indignation. I don't really know. But Ray Bilby kept on going. Big mouth. Shortly after, I suppose by the time I got up to about L, J-K-L maybe, Totty came back to the room. Well, it was as if she had entered a snake pit. If there were 50 of us in the room, 49 of them had their hands up. Miss, miss, miss. Well, Miss wondered what had gone on. Had murder been committed? Had someone exposed themselves or pooped their pants or something? What was wrong, said Toddy. And they chorused out, Ray Bilby went on to K. Oh, my God, it was the crime of the century. Well, Toddy wasn't all that sympathetic, I might add, but, as far as Toddy was concerned, you were only supposed to know as much as she taught. But maybe she became accustomed to it after a while, because she was very kind to me ultimately. And but I did learn then that don't stand out, do not stand out, and do not stand out in Charleville, that's for sure. Or maybe do not stand out in any country town, because you will get, hammered down very, very quickly. And so, I was not carried away by pride, or I was not carried away by a desire to demonstrate my talent or anything like that. I was simply carried away by the rhythm of it all, you know. Once you get into the flight of saying the alphabet, what's to stop you? Well, I wasn't stopping. And I suppose I assumed that the others would follow, but no. They were like an express train coming to a sudden halt at J, and so on. So that was my first lesson. But it was an important lesson, I suppose. I learned in life, never trust the mob. Don't trust the mob unless you're absolutely sure of something. Unless you've got yourself protected, don't rely on the mob. The mob will not be of any use to you. So that was an important lesson in life, I suppose. Okay, then. And Totty was, you know, she understood children very well. And there was an incident that happened one day, again, in that same room. Now, her main classroom and that particular room was separated by doors that were supposed to be folding doors. But I don't think the folding part of it worked. I never saw them open, that's for sure, because I think they were sort of so ingrained with dirt that there was no possibility of their being open. But they would have opened into a much larger room. But anyway, I never saw them opened. But they did have a frosted sort of glass in their panels, grey, and you couldn't see through. They weren't transparent, but you could see shadows, you know, shadow play. Anyway, one day we were in the classroom, all of us minus one apparently, and Totty. And as Totty was there facing the frosted panels, she could see a small ghostly figure enter the room and drift over towards something. Well, she knew what the something was, and the something was her, we'll call it handbag. She used to have a handbag, not a handbag, like a basket, brown, rectangular in shape, with handles on it, and she always carried that to school. Anyway, this small figure drifted over towards the handbag, and maybe she could see the arm going into the handbag. Well, theft was afoot, and the thief was unaware that they're involved in shadow play. Well, okay, then what was Totty to do? Totty crept into the room, and lo and behold, she caught the thief. I will not name the thief, you know, embarrassment and so on. And anyway, she caught the thief, and the thief had pinched 2 bob out of her bag, but she retrieved the 2 bob very quickly. Okay, well, I suppose she dragged the culprit. Now, I might add, there's another story connected with this particular person, but we'll leave that. But this family lived over the line. Okay. Now, in those days, in the early 40s, if you lived over the line, it was, no one would, even Lower King Street, shunned over the line. Oh, dear. And if you knew anyone over the line, or you knew that anyone lived over the line, oh, dear, it was the pits, I can tell you. It was also known as, what do they call it? Not ringworm. There's some worm. Hookworm Hill, yes, Hookworm Hill. That's what it was. That was another name for it among a certain class, I suppose. But anyway, this particular family of the boy who pinched the 2 bob from Totty lived over the line. Okay, well, that was enough. But anyway, how was he to be punished? He was certainly to be punished. And this may have occurred about 3 o'clock, I think. And our finish time in those days must have been 3:30. Well, I don't know. How would you have punished the boy? Well, Totty knew just exactly how to punish the boy, because the punishment, you see, was not one that he had to have inflicted upon him, but it was a punishment from which we were supposed to take some joy, I think, and feel some sense of superiority. And so Totty's punishment was this. She said, that's the rest of the class, we would all be let out 5 minutes early, and that boy would be let out at the regular time. That boy would be let out at 3:30. And we were to run home. And if we all ran home, we would be first home, and we would beat Ackland Hudson home. And Ackland Hudson would be the last boy home. Well, I ran like the wind all the way down to Lower King Street, and I ran in, breathless. My mother said, "What's wrong?" I said, "We've got to run home to beat this boy home." Well, I don't know how impressed my mother was, but nevertheless, I was enormously impressed that I felt sure that I would have beaten that particular boy home, although I was in Lower King Street and he had only to go to over the line. Okay, and now I think, I was very impressed by this, and certainly I ran the whole way, and I dare say probably others did too. Well, maybe, but I followed instructions, you see. Of course, I don't think the boy who lived over the line cared one jot. His regret was not he was late home. His regret was that he hadn't succeeded in getting the 2 bob. And so there we are. But anyway, that was an incident in Toddy's class, in that I learned never trust the mob. And the other thing I learned was that punishment doesn't necessarily have to be via the cane or shouting out or anything like that. Punishment can be delivered in other ways, and the effect of the punishment is not necessarily upon the offender. The effect of the punishment may well be most beneficial to those who are not being punished. So, I think Toddy was a fairly wise woman, but she was a good teacher, and well, insofar as you were capable of learning to read and write, you did. And so that was our Toddy. I remember we used to go down, and there was a little in the yard, just near the pepperina tree, the wood heap and so on. And she used to play What's the Time, Mr. Wolf with us. And Toddy was a shorter woman, a little bit squat, I think, and, very long skirts down to her ankles and so on. And we would begin playing What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, and Toddy would walk along, and we would have to call out to Toddy, "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" And the wolf, being Toddy, would say, 10 o'clock. And then she would keep on walking, and "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" 11:30 or 11:30. And Toddy would keep on walking. And then we might say, "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" And Toddy would cry, "Dinner time," and she would turn and rush. And if you were caught, you had to join her and be one of the wolves. And so you'd continue on, "What's the time?" And each time when she announced, or the crowd announced, "Dinner time," they turned, and you had to go. Now, I was a very cunning child. Some children must have been, what would one say, bovine, maybe. They always got caught, and caught so easily. I didn't care what time they were planning to say. I prepared myself as if every time was going to be dinner time, and boy, was I ready to run. So I was always one of the very last caught. I don't know that I was necessarily the last caught, but nevertheless I would have been one of the very last caught, because I learned, assume that every time was dinner time, and you be ready to run. And I could run, and away I went. Okay, that was, so Toddy had us in grade Prep 1 and Prep 2. Prep 3 and Prep 4 we were taught by Mrs. Hollett. Now, I can't tell you any stories about Mrs. Hollett. There's only one thing I know about her, and that was that everyone loved her. She was very lovely, very kind lady. There were no stories connected with her, but it was just nice always to be in her class. And so, no, she was an absolute delight. Then we moved on into grade 1. Now, in grade 1, we had a teacher called Miss Luck. And I had this Damascus moment almost. You see, people used to say to us, even from the time we started school, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" It was a standard question, you see. Well, in Prep 1, Prep 2, Prep 3 and Prep 4, I didn't know. But one day I was sitting in Miss Luck's class, and it suddenly occurred to me, I want to be a teacher. And I kept that idea for the rest of my life. It was, a message from heaven, I suppose. I'm not quite sure. But Miss Luck, I have only one regret about Miss Luck. I thought she was pretty good. But she brought a book to school, and she used to read from it from time to time, called Dookie the Indian Boy. And I thought the story of Dookie the Indian Boy was very wonderful. But for some reason or another, she never finished it. Well, this broke my heart. I often wondered what happened to Dookie the Indian Boy. I've even looked up Dookie the Indian Boy on the internet, but to no purpose. It was only a splendid little book. I wanted to ask her, would she finish the story, but while I had a big mouth, I was also fairly shy, and so I wanted to ask her to read the end of Dookie the Indian Boy, but maybe she'd lost the book, or maybe the two-bob boy had stolen it or something. I don't know, but we never did hear the end of the Dookie the Indian Boy. Okay, we moved on then into grade 2. Grade 2 was a horrible year. We had a young teacher there, a fellow called Lionel Brandt, and I don't think he would have lasted long teaching because I don't think he liked teaching. His manner, his attitude was all right. He didn't like us, we didn't like him. And he had a German name, too, into the bargain. And remember, this was 43, 44, 45. This was 46. And that name, Brandt. Oh, I tell you. Anyway, but we didn't like him. And I didn't like him. And he didn't like me, and he didn't like us. And it was a horrible year. And it was a year that there was an element of sadness about it because I loved music, and he was the very first person that I came across who could play the piano really well. And we used to go down to music lessons once a week. That was half an hour. Singing, it was called. We went to singing. And Lionel Brandt was a very wonderful pianist, and it was the first time I heard anyone playing the piano and wonderful chords and so on. And if only he had known that he had a skill that was certainly capable of endearing me to him, and was certainly capable of making my life in that grade much, much more enjoyable. But he had no idea of how to use that particular talent that he had just to the benefit of his own work. Oh, dear. It was a terrible year. I really hated that year. In grade 3, we had a red-headed teacher. I remember no more. Mr. Coomber, red-headed. I can't remember anything more about him. Nothing at all, except he had red hair. So grade 3 must have been a fairly... But we didn't dislike him, and he didn't dislike us. Okay, now I got to grade 4. Now I then moved into the vintage years, I suppose. In grade 4, I had a teacher... No, whoa, wait a moment. Grade 1, Miss Luck. Grade 2, Lionel Brandt. And I think Mr. Coomber must also have been... grade 2. Grade 3 was Mr. Coomber. Grade 4... No. Let me go back. We must have had those two teachers in that year, Mr. Coomber and Mr. Brandt. In grade 3, we had the wonderful Jack Walsh. Jack was the tall man. He was the man of whom it was said that he used the balcony of Hull's Hotel as a convenience, shall we say. But he was a good fellow. We liked him. He was popular with the football crowd. He liked a drop or two, I think. But nevertheless, he was good. We quite liked him. But one of the highlights of my primary career was grade 4. Oh, what a time we had. We had a fellow called Henry Schonheimer. Henry was not a pretty man, and he was not a handsome man. In fact, he was fairly ugly. And so when he walked into the room on the first day, he did not present well. But how did he begin? He wrote his name on the blackboard, Schonheimer, and he said, "That is my name, Schonheimer. Learn it, and have it learned by the time. Write it out, and you'll be tested tomorrow. Schonheimer." So we learned Schonheimer. Well, I certainly learned Schonheimer and could spell it on the following day. But Henry, if you listen to the other day, when I talked to the other teachers in years after that, they told me what a terrible teacher Henry was and the terrible disorder in his class. And, you name it. Henry was about the worst teacher ever. But that was not my impression at all. And all the stories the teachers tell were certainly not stories that I recalled of anything in our classroom. Henry had a way of making learning so exciting. Oh, his classes were exciting and interesting, and it was just a pleasure every day to go and to learn. And Henry was just wonderful. Little, of course, did we or the other teachers who so bad-mouthed him over the years realise that Henry became Professor of Education. I don't know whether it was at Monash University or Melbourne University, but Henry became very famous in years after that. As I say, Professor of Education at either Monash or Melbourne, author of God only knows how many textbooks and so on, but he was one of the great gurus of education in Australia in years to come. But he was there in Charleville and he taught us in Year 4. And I don't care what the other teachers said about him. My time in his class was absolutely wonderful. It was a great pleasure to be in the class. Grade 5, we had 2 teachers. The main teacher there was, the teacher I was fondest of, I suppose, overall. A woman called Miss Dray, Gay Dray. And, lovely woman. But she was a great music teacher, and of course that endeared me to her immediately. And she stayed there until, I don't know how long she had been there, but in our year, grade 5, she stayed until about the August holidays. And then she left. She was moved somewhere to, I don't know, Harvey Bay or somewhere like that. She came to a little town called Waluga. And after she left, and for many, many years afterwards, probably 20 years afterwards, I used regularly to correspond with her. And, she was a wonderful person, really, really wonderful. And she knew that I was interested in music, and at one stage when I was in Brisbane, when I was studying in Brisbane, she came down to Brisbane, and I remember there was a performance at Her Majesty's Theatre in Queen Street, and she took me to see, I think it was The Merry Widow, if I remember rightly. If it wasn't The Merry Widow, it was the Pirates of Penzance. One or the other, I can't. But it was the first time I'd seen a full glamorous production on stage. I was really quite overwhelmed by it. And but Gay Dray was absolutely wonderful. She was followed for a couple of months by a fellow called what's his name, John Concannon. John Concannon must have been a fairly young fellow at the time, although we thought even young teachers were ancient and so on. And he taught me just there for a couple of months. Anyway, a couple of months. I didn't come across him then. That would have been 13, 12, 11. And I didn't come across him then until, about 20 years later, a bit less than that, I'm not quite sure. That would have been 49, we'll make that 50 to 66, 16. I came across him about 16 years later, and I was at the university. I was doing a master's degree. And I walked into a lecture theatre on the very first day, and who should be in the same lecture theatre as me at that time but John Concannon. So the pupil of 1949 in grade 5 met the teacher of 1949 in a lecture room at the UQ in 1966. And this was the honour, 4th year honours year in English. Most degrees in those days used to be 3-year degrees, but a few people, very, very few, did the honours year. And, you may have started with 1,000 English students in English 1, but by the time you got to English 4, there were only 12. And anyway, John came down, and John was in that particular class. And he used to think I was a pain in the bum, but, well, in some ways he thought I was a pain in the bum, I think. Excuse me. I had a cousin, or my father had a cousin called Akers, Tom Akers. And I remember we visited Tom's house once, and he had a big sign up on his wall. And I thought, that's a Beelby sign, that's for sure. Because the sign said, lead, follow, or get out of the bloody road. And I thought, that's not a bad philosophy, lead, follow, or get out of the bloody road. And I used to think about this when we'd be crossing the road after lectures at the university at that time. And as far as I was concerned, when you crossed the road, you looked after yourself. Lead yourself. If the others want to follow, let them follow, but that was their problem. But John thought I should do, the sort of Sir Walter Raleigh bit of laying out the cloak or something in case, someone might step in mud or whatever. And he'd say, look after yourself. Yes, you only look after yourself. Indeed, John, I do look after myself. You would be advised to look after yourself. He was a bit of a pain in the bum, but nevertheless. Anyway, on we go. Then in grade 6 and grade 7, we had Bill Adams. Now, Bill Adams was a local boy, and there were two gun teachers in those days. The two gun teachers were Eric Häusler and Bill Adams. And I think Eric must have been an import to the town, but he'd been there a fair length of time. He had a nice house up there near the water tower, high house near the water tower. I saw a house in Charleville on the market for about $300,000 in the last couple of days. I thought, I think that may well be a tarted-up version of Eric Häusler's house, but I'm not sure. But anyway, the two gun teachers were Eric and Bill Adams. And I had Bill Adams for those 2 years, and Bill drove us, that's for sure. As a teacher, I wouldn't have given him really top marks as a teacher. I wouldn't have put him in the Henry Schonheimer category, but Bill was he must have been inspired by drovers, cattle drovers, and he knew all about stock whips and that type of thing, and he certainly drove us, that's for sure. But, a successful teacher can raise the level of even the most bovine child. But a successful teacher also can seem enormously successful simply because of the talent of his students. And in our particular class, I think Bill was very lucky because it was really a very talented class, very, very able class. And, many people there in the class who were really very good. And Bill was lucky. And so, when scholarship came, a few of us did very well. And a lot of others did also well, in a sense, very well. They weren't, in the high 90 people, but they might have been 80 in the 80% and so on, and that was pretty good. And Bill had a lot of kids in the class like that. There were a few at the bottom of the class who weren't much chop, but they were nice kids. I will mention no names, but I can think of a couple of them. They were thick as bricks, but they were good people, nice people, and they probably went on to have very successful lives. Now, Bill attempted to drive them and coerce them, I would have thought. He did, have a waddy, which he threatened to use from time, and I think maybe he did sometimes. And that didn't endear me to him particularly. I thought that was really... these kids at the bottom of the class, if they didn't get 8 out of 10, they'd get a wallop. I took some exception to that, but nevertheless. But the important thing was, if you take all of these teachers together, they had something to teach, and they were determined to teach it, and they were determined that we were going to learn it. But what they had to teach, they valued it. They believed that it was important. They believed that it would be passed on. They had a belief. These people these days who go off to university and do a Bachelor of Education, I wouldn't do, I wouldn't use it in the toilet. Look, it's all very well to learn, the theory of education, but you've got to have something to teach. These education degrees and degrees like that, they assume that, you have a spirit or something that you go and you teach. Look, if you're going to teach, you've got to have something to teach. But gee, a lot of people these days have got nothing to teach, but they've got education degrees. Oh, they've done comparative education. They've done the theory of this and the theory of that. It has the value of the theory of washing up, I can tell you. But, no. But they had these two qualities. The first quality is we've combined them. They had something to teach. and they valued it, and they believed that we should learn it, and they were determined that that was going to happen. But they had another quality, and this was a quality that began to manifest itself from about Henry Schonheimer's time on. They knew that whatever education you might have in life, the school could give you only part of it. And they would impart they could impart that part of it as best they could. But they had also to impart not only the ordinary basic box and dice of learning, the basic education of, reading and writing and all of those things. They also imbued in us the notion that you had an individual responsibility for completing your education. The school could do so much, but you had to be inspired somehow or other to realise that there was so much learning beyond that, and it was your responsibility to get out and find it and learn it. Now, this will be, of course, in a different form for different people. But they certainly got that idea into my head, and so they couldn't give me they could give me the beginnings. But if I was going to master literature and history and art and, whatever else might have been the field of learning that would be of interest to you, it was your responsibility to get out and find it. Because, the school had its limits. And if you restricted yourself to the limits of the school, you were going to lead a fairly thin sort of life. They said, get out, and if you're going to be an educated person, the educated person has mastered rather more than the school can give you. And you have a duty. Get out. Understand your culture, understand your history, understand all of that. And that's for you to discover, and you've got to get on and do it. And it was that philosophy that those teachers managed to imbue in us, or certainly in me, and I'm sure that I wasn't alone. And so I give great thanks to those teachers, first of all, for having something to teach. Secondly, for believing that they needed to teach it and we needed to learn it. And the third thing was that was only part of the learning that we needed to complete our education, and that the rest of us, the responsibility was ours, and so on. That took me to year 7, and then after that we went into high school. Now, the high school, in a sense, in those days was a disaster, an absolute disaster, and I curse the education department for that. They were not running a high school. They were running an old-fashioned commercial course, old-fashioned commercial class that was designed to sort of stock the offices of town, Winchcombe, Carson and solicitors and whatever else. They needed a typist. We went into the high school, and my parents knew no different because they had no great education. Their school had a high school. They couldn't afford to send me to school, so off I went to the local high school there. Did I do any science? No. Did I do any foreign language? No. And it would have been nice if we'd done some maths, but they sent 2 teachers there who knew no maths. Oh, dear. We had a typing teacher who taught us Maths B, that was geometry and so on. And then we had, oh dear. I remember the one fellow, he's an English teacher. First lesson in algebra. Let x be the unknown quantity. I thought, what's he talking about? I said, I don't understand. Well, a good teacher can find another way of saying it, but no, his way of saying it was, let x be the unknown quantity. And that's all he knew, let x be the unknown quantity. Well, God, I had to work it out for myself eventually. But it certainly didn't come from him. And the other one, schools, state schools sometimes have, pretty crook teachers, and you get rid of them if you can. Well, this fellow had obviously been got rid of from a city school, and he ended up in Charleville. Well, he sort of knew his English, but he didn't know anything more. But he was our maths teacher. He was our maths teacher for Maths A, Maths B. He knew no maths. I tell you. Well, in other words, our mathematics learning stopped at year 7 because the 2 teachers we had knew no maths. The really useless one, the one who obviously had been pushed on from some city school. Oh, Ray, can you work that out? Well, Ray could sometimes work it out, and Ray could sometimes not work it out. And then we'd gather round, and he would try to follow. Oh, I tell you. Anyway, that took me through to the junior exam in at Charleville. Then, of course, people used to say to me, "Look, do not be led astray. Do not leave school after junior. Certainly, do not leave school after scholarship, as many kids did." And so I went down to State High. Well, I remember going into State High and, they said, "What did you get in a scholarship?" And I told them. They said, "Oh, very good, very good. Okay. Now, now, what science did you do?" Well, look, they wouldn't have quite put it like that because it was taken for granted. You did physics or chemistry. Well, I said, "I haven't done any physics or chemistry." Oh? Well, they said you'd better do physics. I had to begin I had to begin doing physics in year 11, having done none before. I didn't do any chemistry, so then they said, "Now, what about your mathematics?" And, well, the truth was I hadn't done any mathematics since scholarship. "Well, you'll have to do Maths 1 and Maths 2. So I had to begin doing Maths 1 and Maths 2 based on nothing beyond scholarship. Physics, with no physics at all. Oh, it was a tough time, I can tell you. No language, of course. Now, ultimately, I became reasonably competent with French, but that was because I had to get in and teach myself junior French, senior French, and then get myself into university French. And but I don't thank the department for that at all. I took many years to, recoup those lost years. But that was the department's fault. The department treated Charleville very, very badly. They didn't even bother giving it a high school. They called it a high school, a secondary department, but in fact, it was nothing more than the old commercial, as they called it, from the 20s, where they were training people to work, in solicitors' offices and really, they call them Munchkin-Carson or something like that. It was a shame, the shame of the education department, and I still say that unapologetically to this day. And we were staffed by the refuse, in one instance particularly, of city high schools where obviously the teacher was intent upon getting rid of him. So they got rid of him to Charleville. And so there we are. But anyway, they were the supporting cast, if you like. The star of the cast was none other than Borley Kirk, but I'll come to Borley Kirk subsequently.